The country that has built its entire geopolitical identity on being the gas station for the world is running out of fuel. This isn't a localized issue, it's a visible, systemic breakdown, a powerful paradox that proves the war has finally come home and is hitting the Russian state at its most vulnerable point, its economy. For the past month, the evidence has been overwhelming. Across the vast territory of Russia, from the Far East to the occupied territories of Crimea, images and videos have flooded social media, showing a scene straight out of a crisis movie. We are seeing kilometer-long queues snaking out from gas stations at night, with drivers waiting 5 or more hours in desperation, only to drive away empty-handed. The ubiquitous sign at pumps across multiple regions now reads AI-95 out of stock. This isn't panic buying. This is a reality confirmed by every local report. A global oil superpower cannot fuel its own cars. This profound failure to provide a basic necessity highlights the depth of the state's collapse. The crisis began in the most remote areas, but it is now spreading rapidly through central and southern Russia. In Primorsky Krai, drivers are reporting that out of 11 stations in some districts, only a handful have fuel, forcing desperate locals to compete with summer tourists for the last few liters. In Sabaikalsky Krai, the situation is so severe that sales of the crucial AI-95 gasoline have been completely restricted for private citizens, reserved only for government organizations and essential services. This isn't just an inconvenience, it's a terrifying throwback to the Soviet era, with the return of the dreaded Talon system, coupons, in places like occupied Crimea, a physical manifestation of a modern economy suddenly breaking down. The official narrative coming from governors and regional officials is a predictable lie. They are blaming summer peak consumption, tourists, logistical bottlenecks, and road repairs. These flimsy excuses are meant to mask the reality. The system is being strained to the breaking point by the direct military consequences of the war. But the citizens of Russia and the residents of occupied territories are smarter than that. They see the truth in the long queues, and they see the reality in the escalating prices. The nervousness at the gas pumps, the fighting over the last few liters, the frantic sharing of fuel addresses on social media is the visible sign of a system that has lost control. This is not a failure of climate or logistics, it is a direct consequence of a strategic campaign. The shortage of fuel is proof that the war has returned to Russia with a vengeance. Ukraine, unable to be defeated on the battlefield, has found the most potent weapon of all, the strategic attack on Russia's oil refining capabilities. The current crisis is a direct result of these kinetic sanctions, a calculated campaign that has been underway for months. This is a deliberate, systemic assault designed to cripple the logistics that fuel the Russian army and to prove to the Russian people that the war is not a distant concern, but a crisis that is now directly affecting their daily lives. The fuel crisis is the final, undeniable evidence that the war is being lost, and it is a political and economic disaster that the Kremlin cannot hide.
We have seen the shock on the streets, but to understand why a country that exports oil by the barrel is now begging for gasoline, we must shift our focus from the symptoms to the strategic cause. This crisis is not an accident of nature or logistics. It is the direct, calculated result of a highly successful military campaign that we call kinetic sanctions. This campaign is the deliberate application of military force to achieve an overwhelming economic effect. The core piece of evidence is undeniable. Ukrainian drone strikes have knocked out a massive, critical portion of Russia's oil refining capacity. Intelligence assessments confirm that these strikes have reduced the total refining capacity by an estimated 8% to 14%. This is a colossal loss. A single hit on a primary distillation column or a cracking unit can halt an entire plant's production for weeks or even months. The collective impact of these precision strikes on facilities in the Volga region, the South, and the Far East is now manifesting as a national breakdown. This is a military victory that has created a financial and logistical crisis. The crisis was not just caused by the drone strikes, it was amplified by a catastrophic systemic failure within the Russian state. The drone strikes landed at the exact moment a perfect storm of bureaucratic and logistical chaos was brewing. Many major refineries had scheduled maintenance that was supposed to happen in the spring but was deliberately postponed for military reasons. When the drone attacks forced several key plants offline in the summer, the facilities that should have been running were already closed for unrelated planned repairs. This created a massive, immediate fuel shortage. The system was pushed past its breaking point, showing that the Russian state is incapable of managing its civilian needs while simultaneously running a total war economy. The final piece of this disastrous puzzle is the logistical collapse. Russia is a country of immense distances, and delivering fuel relies on an already strained network of railways and pipelines. When the fuel is gone, the logistical chain cannot compensate. There are simply not enough specialized rail tankers to move fuel across thousands of kilometers to replace the local supply that was lost. This is why the crisis hit the remote regions first, places like Primorsky Krai and Zabaikalsky Krai, and why the shortage is now spreading westward. The inability to rapidly move fuel is a damning indictment of a military-first logistics system that has no redundancy for civilian needs. This is the ultimate reason the official excuses, blaming tourists and hot weather, are transparent lies. These official narratives are desperate attempts to hide a truth that is now obvious to every driver in a kilometer-long queue. The state is incapable of protecting its most critical infrastructure, and it is failing to adapt to the realities of a war it started. The kinetic sanctions campaign is working because it has found the single most vulnerable choke point in the Russian system. The fuel crisis is the direct, painful proof that the war is coming home.
We've established the strategic cause of the crisis, the direct hits to the refineries. But the most immediate and politically damaging consequence is the collapse of social stability across Russia. This isn't just an economic footnote, it's a terrifying regression into the past, a visible sign that the state can no longer manage the most basic necessities of modern life. The chaos on the streets is the real evidence that the war has returned home, and it is hitting the Russian population where they feel it most directly, in their car tanks. The evidence of this breakdown is stark. Across vast regions of the country, from the southern borderlands to the remote reaches of the Far East, we are seeing the return of symbols of scarcity and failure. The long, frustrating queues at the gas pumps are not just a logistical problem, they are a psychological time warp. Drivers are forced to wait for hours, hoping to obtain the last precious liters of fuel. This collective desperation, the fighting over limited supplies, the frantic sharing of fuel locations on social media, is a direct throwback to the instability of the 1990s and the worst years of the Soviet regime. For a leadership that has staked its entire legitimacy on the promise of stability and prosperity, this is a catastrophic public relations failure. But the most damning sign of the crisis is the literal return of the ration system. In regions like Crimea and Zabaikalsky Krai, gasoline is no longer available for free purchase at many pumps. It is sold only by talon, or coupon, reserved for state enterprises or those with special contracts. This is not a temporary inconvenience. It is a fundamental admission of the state's inability to maintain a functioning market economy. The government is essentially admitting that it has lost control over the distribution of its most vital commodity. When a major oil exporting nation has to ration fuel to its own citizens, it is a clear sign that the system is failing at a core level. The desperation of the authorities to cover up this truth has led to a barrage of transparent lies. We've heard every excuse imaginable from regional governors and local officials. They blame seasonal tourism, road repairs, and even citizens hoarding fuel in jerry cans. These flimsy narratives are a desperate attempt to obscure the truth of a military and bureaucratic failure. The officials are under immense pressure to maintain the illusion of stability, but the reality is breaking through. The heads of occupied territories, such as the official in Crimea, have been forced to publicly acknowledge the truth. The problem is the war, the destroyed logistics, and the crippled refineries. This public concession reveals the magnitude of the crisis, a direct contradiction of the centralized propaganda. This social chaos has a direct and immediate military consequence. The crisis of the civilian economy is now a direct attack on the Russian military's own logistics tail. We must address the persistent myth that the military is somehow immune because its heavy armor runs on diesel. The reality is that the vast majority of small-scale logistics, the transport of personnel, the generators that power communications and drones, and the vehicles bought by volunteers to support the front, all rely on gasoline. The widespread shortage means that soldiers are now competing with civilians for fuel, or being forced to rely on the black market to keep their most vital equipment running. This chaos erodes morale and confirms a profound systemic failure that is directly impacting combat readiness. The system's inability to provide a basic necessity to its own people is now threatening its ability to fight a war.
We've established the chaos on the civilian streets, but for a military expert, the most critical part of this fuel crisis is its direct, devastating impact on the Russian army's ability to fight. This isn't just a political embarrassment, it's a strategic attack on the most vulnerable link in their entire supply chain, a military victory achieved without firing a single shot on the front line. The crisis is not just inconveniencing the Russian population, it is bleeding the Russian military dry. The key to understanding this threat is to debunk the persistent diesel myth. The common assumption is that the Russian military is immune to gasoline shortages because its heavy armor, the tanks, the infantry fighting vehicles, and the heavy artillery runs on diesel fuel. That is correct, but it is also a fatal oversight. The heavy equipment fights the war of the last century. The true weapons of this war are fought and powered by gasoline. This is a conflict dominated by the drone artillery complex, and that complex cannot function without a constant, reliable supply of high-octane fuel. Think about the components of a modern Russian fighting position and what runs on gasoline. It is the drones, the FPV kamikazes, the Orlan and Zala reconnaissance drones, and the generators that charge their batteries that are the eyes and the immediate striking power of the Russian army. A drone operator cannot fly a mission if their generator is silent. A field command post loses its communication when its backup generator runs dry. And most critically, the light vehicles and pickup trucks, often donated by volunteers, that are essential for the rapid movement of personnel, casualty evacuation, and high-value equipment near the front line, all run on gasoline. When the civilian gas stations close, the military's forward-most logistics, the critical small logistics, cease to function. This turns a domestic problem into a strategic military advantage for Ukraine. The crisis doesn't stop a T-90 tank 300 kilometers away, but it starves the forward observation post of intelligence. It slows down the evacuation of the wounded, which directly impacts troop morale and the will to fight. And it compromises the ability to launch a drone swarm, which is the only effective countermeasure the Russian army has against Ukrainian attacks. The shortage is a silent killer, weakening the Russian defense day by day, not through a massive frontal assault, but through the mundane, relentless process of fuel deprivation. The profound systemic failure revealed by this crisis is that the Russian military is forcing its own soldiers to fight for fuel. Reports from the ground confirmed that Russian troops are competing with civilians in queues or are forced to buy fuel on the black market at exorbitant prices. This is not just a logistical hurdle, it is a breakdown of the state's most fundamental duty to supply its army. When a soldier must use his own money to buy black market gasoline to charge the battery of the drone that is supposed to save his life, it is a testament to the fact that the entire system has collapsed. This breakdown in morale and supply is the final, undeniable proof that the campaign of kinetic sanctions is one of the most effective strategic weapons of this war. The crisis of gasoline, therefore, is a direct attack on the blood of the Russian military's logistical tail. It is a brilliant strategy that exploits the rigidity of a top-down authoritarian system. The war has forced Russia to prioritize its heavy industries, but the Ukrainian response has been to target the flexible, smaller systems that run the war of the 21st century.
The resulting crisis is a direct threat to the Army's ability to maintain its frontline operations, and it is a powerful indicator that the ultimate military defeat of Russia is not just a possibility, but an inevitability. We have spent this time methodically dissecting the layers of Russia's economic and logistical disaster. We've moved from the shock of the national fuel shortage to the cold, hard data of a collapsing budget. Now, we must deliver the final verdict. The panic in the Kremlin is not just justified, it is the logical response of a leadership that realizes it has lost control over the very mechanisms that sustain its power. The end of this war will not come from a massive tank battle. It will come from this systemic, undeniable financial collapse. The evidence synthesized from every sector, finance, industry, and logistics, points to a single, inevitable conclusion. This is a multifaceted crisis that has rendered the continuation of the war politically and financially impossible. The system is under assault from within and without. Internally, the economic leadership is frantically trying to fill a record budget deficit by raising taxes and risking hyperinflation, all to fund a war budget they cannot afford. Externally, sanctions are finally working, cutting off export revenue and forcing major trading partners to abandon the Russian market. And the catalyst for this final breakdown is the kinetic sanctions campaign, which has created a domino effect. The loss of refining capacity led to a nationwide fuel crisis, which is now strangling the light logistics that feed the front lines. This is the ultimate paradox of the regime. It must choose between two equally catastrophic outcomes. The Russian leadership is trapped in a no-win scenario. If they choose to continue the war, they guarantee economic collapse, hyperinflation, and a domestic crisis that will erode the last vestiges of their social contract. The mass withdrawal of deposits from banks and the widespread chaos of the fuel shortage are already visible signs that the social patience is wearing thin. If they choose to end the war, they face immediate political instability but save the state's financial future. Their stubborn unwillingness to choose the rational path makes the catastrophic collapse a certainty. A modern army cannot run on pride and propaganda. It runs on gasoline and cash, and Russia is rapidly running out of both. This is the real reason the leadership is panicked. The crisis is not just an economic inconvenience, it is a direct existential threat to the dictator's power. His power is built on a narrative of stability and competence. The long queues for fuel, the visible decay of the civilian economy, and the humiliation of seeing a key national asset, the oil industry, crippled by cheap drones, all erode that core claim. A dictator's power rests on the perception of absolute control, and this crisis proves that he has lost control over the most basic necessities of life. The budget hole is a wound that cannot be bandaged. It's a political vortex that is now sucking the entire system into financial ruin. The final verdict on this war is that it will end on Ukraine's terms, delivered by the relentless pressure of economic collapse. The victory will not be marked by the raising of a flag over the Kremlin, but by the moment the Kremlin realizes it can no longer pay its bills. The Russian leadership's inability to adapt, its failure to protect its most critical infrastructure, and its self-destructive commitment to a war it cannot afford are the final, damning pieces of evidence. The war is lost, and the only thing left to do is to wait for the system to run out of fuel and cash.